All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us to this insect sampling 101 presentation this evening. This is part of our Pollinator Monitoring web series. We've recorded a few of these trainings to help get folks started, to have a nice base of understanding to prepare them for some in the field work of hands-on pollinator monitoring. This year, we'll be sharing a little bit more about our future plans to involve volunteers and community members in these monitoring and science, community science projects. My name is Amy Kilgore. I am the Outreach Program Manager for Great River Greening. I use she, her pronouns, and I am happy to be here with you all tonight. Great River Greening does habitat restoration throughout much of the state of Minnesota, and a lot of that comes with pollinator habitat enhancement. So we're really excited to learn more about what we're seeing out there, what you're seeing out there, and utilizing programs like Inaturalist and different pollinator sampling techniques. So we look forward to learning more tonight from Britt, but I'm going to hand it over to Becca Tucker, who is one of Great River Greening's ecologists and project managers, to tell you a little bit more about the pollinator specific work we'll be doing.
Well, thanks, Amy. As she mentioned, I'm Becca Tucker. I'm one of the program managers at Great River Greening, and we, as a nonprofit habitat restoration organization based in St. Paul, are doing a lot of, I think, pretty exciting things this spring that are geared towards pollinators. So we're doing a number of pollinator plantings, so anything from turf to prairie conversions to prairie enhancements, and looking at not only diversifying plant species, but also seeing if our efforts on the plant side are actually making a difference for the pollinator populations. So that's where monitoring comes in. And that's hopefully where you folks come in as well. And what we're going to talk about tonight is pretty much that, how to do it. And I'm going to throw this over to Britt Forsberg now, and she's going to give us an introduction on pollinator monitoring.
Great. Thanks. So I'm Britt Forsberg. I'm an extension educator for University of Minnesota Extension, particularly with the Master Naturalist program. And my role there is working with volunteer education. But I can't quite say in a previous life, because it was really like only 2 years ago, but came from managing the Minnesota Bee Atlas, which was a statewide citizen or community science project that was trying to figure out what bees we even have in Minnesota. Hard to track how well they're doing when you don't have baseline data. And so we were able to fill in the gap with the help of a lot of volunteers across the state and learn more about stem nesting bees and bumblebees in particular. So tonight we'll talk a bit about kind of different ways that you could be monitoring pollinators. But before then, we'll go with why. Why would you do this? You know, where is their value? So then what we would do, and then where can you individually plug in? So we'll go right into it, but I will say if you have questions, you can go ahead, you can use the raise hand feature in Zoom, then I should be able to get a little pop-up. If you'd rather type them in the chat, go ahead. If they make sense with whatever we're talking about on that slide, I'll address it right away. And if it's something that, I just might save it for the end if that makes more sense. And if I just plain don't see it, we'll also get to it in the end. I'm going to lean on Amy and Becca to help me out a little bit with that. All right, so a couple of different reasons that we would look at this. One on the left, I have a picture of a rusty patch bumblebee. Rusty patch bumblebees are a federally listed endangered species. So monitoring becomes incredibly important. First, to even determine if a species warrants being placed in the endangered species list. But then it's really important to track how well they're doing, where they are. Are they a candidate for further protections? Are they maybe ready to be taken off the list? This requires a lot of attention, again, to what's happening to those population levels. And then on the right, just this beautiful prairie restoration project. It's really helpful to know not just the plants, but as Becca mentioned, what's happening with the insects. So are the insects coming back now that you've added more plants? Are they the insects that you expect to see? The insects you really want to see? With climate change, right? Monitoring helps us know if ranges are expanding or contracting. With bumblebees, it seems like as things get warmer, their southern range is shrinking a little bit, and it's not proportionately expanding northways. But so that has a lot of implications for how we manage pollinators and how we manage habitats. Knowing what pollinators are there helps us know if changing land practices near that spot makes a difference, right? Does it matter that the neighbor took their land out of CRP and put it back into production? Again, we can make a lot of guesses, but we don't know unless we've actually looked at that. So monitoring pollinators, I mean, what would that even mean? You could be looking at a couple of different things. We could be looking at exactly what species are out there. So on the far left, we can see this cute little Bombus impatiens or common eastern bumblebee. They have that kind of scallop pattern with one yellow abdominal segment and the rest is all black. So if you're looking at the exact species, maybe you want to know how many different species there are, right? Is there really rich species diversity? Is it really kind of just one or two species that live there? You might be paying attention to what plants each insect is using. This could be really important if you're looking for specialist bees or insects in particular. So insects that rely on one plant, could be one plant family, plant genus, could be one plant species. So an example a lot of people are familiar with are monarch butterflies. So monarch butterfly caterpillars rely on milkweed plants as their main forage. So finding out what those relationships are helps you make better plans for how you manage habitat. It could be sometimes that you're looking at, again, which plants that they're using, but not just by looking at what plant they're on or nearby, but could be some pollen sampling. So this bumblebee has a huge ball of orange pollen there. So you might be collecting insects, you can knock off that pollen and then do some analysis to figure out what plants that came from. Okay, I will be honest with you guys, monitoring insects is not always easy. And it can be hard for a lot of reasons. In the first example, these might be just really hard to see. So this is a Hylias or masked bee on a yarrow plant. So yarrow have very small flowers. So you can see that this bee is just barely longer than a yarrow flower is wide. It also isn't very showy. It doesn't really look like the bees that we think of, right? It's not bright colored. We don't see stripes. So you could easily walk past and not notice it, or you might think it's an ant. Maybe you think it's not important. In this middle photo, there's a mason bee, Osmia on willow in the early spring. And so sometimes their insects are just not in places that you're looking, right? We think that we should see bees and butterflies on flowers. Well, this willow catkin is a flower, but it's not showy, it's not colorful, it doesn't have the big petals. And it might be just up too high where we're not really paying attention. So that can make it hard to know exactly what insects are out there. The next photo is a notoriously difficult subgenus Dialictus to identify. And so there are very few people in the United States who are really confident identifiers of Dialictus. So someone has managed to find it. They've noticed that it's kind of small and nondescript. They've gotten this picture, but that doesn't mean that we know what it is. It's a species that even the people who can do this ID will need a specimen. And so sometimes it's just gonna be very hard to assess what's out there. So we'll next look at a couple of different ways that you could do some monitoring. Some will be considered lethal and some are not lethal. Insect collecting traditionally does show up insects on pins. When we with the Bee Atlas have talked with different collection managers, they sort of feel like whatever pictures, that's lovely, but for our catalog, for our purposes, we want an insect on a pin. But there are some other ways that don't involve killing insects. But I'll kind of start at the bottom and then we'll bring you up. So we'll do sort of the sad lethal collection methods and then move up to non-lethal. So there are a couple of different kinds. Right here in the left are, we call them cup traps, which actually is so simple as to be just a solo cup on a stick. The bee monitoring listserv is full of funny questions like, which color solo cup did you use? Have you tried this other brand? Well, they stopped making blue solo cups. So where have you guys figured out how to, pivot here? So not all scientific research is really using fancy specialized materials. The picture in the middle is called a Malaise trap. And so insects fly in, they sort of hit the walls, and then the light part at the top, they're funneled up into a little collecting jar here. That's probably filled with ethanol or some other kind of preservative where they would die. The image on the right is of a trap nest. And so stem nesting bees would come in, they would lay their eggs in one of those holes. I'm starting at the very back, lay an egg, give it a ball of pollen, seal that off, and then do that all the way up to the front of the nest, where those larvae inside would overwinter and come out the next year. So all of these have pros and cons. I mean, certainly lethal collecting, if we're concerned about those populations, has some downsides. And then each one of those methods. So no one of those methods is going to be perfect and get you all the information that you want. So in those cup traps, they tend to be skewed towards smaller bees. A lot of people see small sweat bees there, which are one of the kinds of bees that are very hard to identify. It's not always there are other habitat features that can make a difference. So what is happening with nearby flowers? There's one study, if they treated the flowers nearby with herbicide, they found a ton more bees in their cups. And so, what resources are available for the bees changes if they're going to get stuck in one of these cups. It's not always the same depending on what height you have that cup up. How far apart are they? How shady is it? And so sometimes it's hard to say, did we not find something because it's not here, or did we not find it because we had some of those other variables that were off? But they're a really popular way to go collect. They do get a pretty good variety of bees. They're cheap, particularly when you're buying solo cups. And so they're a pretty popular method in the bee monitoring community. These Malaise traps in the middle attract some kinds of insects more than others, similar to those cup traps, and particularly can have a lot of trouble with bears, sort of stumbling in, tearing them apart. The trap nests here, we use those in the Bee Atlas, and you can get a ton of really great information. So what we did is we put a test tube over each one of those holes, and then we could tell when the bee came out, what kind it was, we knew where it came from. You could tell if that nest were parasitized, right? So if there were kind of like cuckoo birds will lay their eggs in another bird's nest. So if there were two different kinds of bees coming out of that hole, right? The first was usually a parasite, nest parasite of the second. You can tell a lot about fecundity, about how those bees are reproducing, because you can identify how many male versus female bees there were. So it really has all this great source of information. But again, it does mean that you are not only killing bees, but you're killing that female's possibly entire offspring for that year. It also is really specific towards basically one kind of bee. So there are two, so yellow-faced bees or masked bees and leafcutter bees are the two that will use that, but you'll find way more leafcutter bees. And so there's just this whole realm of other bee species that aren't even represented there. So if you're interested in this kind of research, I don't right now know of anybody who's asking for volunteer help with cup traps or these Malaise traps, but there is a sort of second level Bee Atlas project that is using trap nests again this summer. And I'm happy when we go to questions, I can pull a link and put it in the chat if that's something you'd like to check out. I would say the other major trade-off to using these kinds of methods is that then you have potentially thousands and thousands of specimens that you need to figure out what to do with. It's a lot of work to pin all those insects. It takes a lot of space once you have them done. And so often, and it's hard to do all that identification. So you often have this huge backlog where you're just starting the next field season. You're not even quite caught up with all the things that you got last field season. All right, we'll move on to happier times, non-lethal methods. So photo-based, and these are all different pollinators and pictures that I've taken just with my cell phone. All right, so one fabulous resource for this sort of thing is Inaturalist. It is both a website and a mobile app. And so you can either take pictures with a digital camera and then go through the website, or you can use your phone. And depending on the phone you have, of course, you have greater or lesser photo quality, but it's really as simple as taking the picture. It will save all of your usually information about where you are, the date, those things, and upload it. It goes off into this enormous database that is global. So there are species and people working across the whole world. One great feature about it is that you don't have to know anything about what you're seeing. You don't have to be any kind of expert. You have to be good at looking and you have to have some practice taking pictures. But it crowdsources identifications. And so you can put it up there with as much or as little detail as you know. If you're pretty sure that you know it's some kind of swallowtail butterfly, great, that's a great start. If you just know that it's a butterfly, that's fine. If you know it's an insect, that's enough. Other users will come along, they'll start refining that identification. If you are wrong, then they can add their identification. And if a couple people agree and you're the one outlier, Inaturalist calls them mavericks, it'll take the most popular identification. And so just because you were the first person to upload it doesn't mean that it trusts you more than it trusts anybody else. Yeah, and then once 2 out of 3 people have agreed on the genus and species for that photo, it will be considered research grade. And so that's sort of just a check mark that we trust this. And so when researchers access the database that goes behind Inaturalist, they'll often filter for just research grade. Like these are ones that they feel are more accurate. So there are some, pros and cons, just like the lethal collecting methods. So it's a definite pro that you get lots and lots of data. I mean, there are millions and millions of observations in Inaturalist right now. It's really easy to use. I feel like if I have taught my mom how to use Inaturalist, my mom who can't answer her cell phone, she picks it up and then can't figure out how to answer it. So your call goes to voicemail and she calls you back. If I've gotten her to learn Inaturalist, I feel like anybody can use it. So again, they've really made it a streamlined process, taken a lot of the burden off the user. And again, you don't have to be an expert. You can learn from doing it. And so a lot of times the other people who are adding identifications will give you reasons for why they chose it. I've never seen an Inaturalist troll. No one ever writes, "Why did you think it was that? I can't believe you were so dumb." Everybody is here because they're interested in science, conservation, and learning. Another pro to using Naturalist is that you can get people who weren't even aware of your project to share their data with you. And so if you filter on Inaturalist, you could say, I'm just interested in seeing all of the moths from Hennepin County. So anybody who uploaded a moth, right, their moth picture comes up in that search essentially. And so you don't have to have gone out and recruited and found these individuals who emailed their moth pictures to you. People who are already using the app essentially agree that their observations are out there. If you are, as a user, concerned about privacy, or maybe you are worried about pictures of rare organisms, you can change your privacy settings essentially so that it won't be as exact with its location. I mean, sometimes I feel weird if I take pictures in my yard and I'm like, huh, my exact house is up there on Naturalist. So if that's you, then you can change that. But it's very helpful for researchers to know where their organism is. So some cons to this system are that not everything gets identified. And sometimes it's because there are species that are really hard to identify. You know, you need to have it on a pin. You need to look at the bumps. You need to look at the number of jagged edges on a tooth. You need to turn it upside down. Sometimes you just get really crummy pictures. We, and with extensions, run the City Nature Challenge in April this year, April 29th to May 2nd. Put in your calendars. Where people across the world try to get as many iNaturalist observations as they can, particularly focusing on urban biodiversity. And every year I go through and I try to add identifications, and I have like a picture of a tree from across the park. Okay, I'm pretty good at identifying plants and trees, but just the silhouette of a tree is not a good enough photo for me. And insects, unlike trees, don't sit still. And so it's not necessarily judging the person who took the picture that it's not a great photo, but sometimes it means that you just can't get them identified. There definitely is a bias towards bigger and more identifiable species. So in the Bee Atlas, we had a section where we had people contribute pictures to iNaturalist, and something like 8 out of the top 10 bees that were most commonly found were bumblebees. Bumblebees are not necessarily 8 out of every 10 bees. The rusty patch bumblebee showed up as one of the top 10 most common bees. Now, if this were true, it would not be an endangered species, right? It happens that bumblebees are easier to identify than a lot of other bees. They're big. You hear them sometimes before you even see them. And so they've drawn your attention to them. So you're more likely to take pictures of them. The other thing is that we've really done a pretty good job, I think, of sharing the message about rusty patch bumblebees being endangered. They're Minnesota state bee. They're pretty endearing for a small insect, right? So more people are out looking for them. More people are taking pictures hoping that it's a rusty patch bumblebee. And so that has definitely skewed the data in iNaturalist towards making it look like there are a lot more rusty patch bumblebees out there. So although it's really important to know where they are and find them, it's not always a good measure of what's happening to their populations. Yeah, and if you don't find them, it doesn't mean that they're not there, right? It really means no one was there and had a picture that they could identify that they uploaded iNaturalist. So Great River Greening also is using iNaturalist. They have a number of sites. Lebanon Hills just happens to be the one that I have a screen grab of here, but they're quite interested in knowing what you're seeing. And so a really great opportunity, maybe if your schedule is less flexible and you need to be doing this on your own time. So they've set up iNaturalist in a way that you don't have to do anything special when you're iNaturalist. If you are within the boundaries of the places that they've set up, your pictures will automatically go up there. So as much as I talked about specific projects, I do want to put a plug in for just casual kind of random iNatting, going out and just noticing something that looks interesting or cool and putting it up. So I'll just talk through these quick photos. Again, all things that I've taken in St. Paul on my cell phone. So the upper left is another rusty patch bumblebee. So it's last summer, 2 blocks away from my house. And so I'm very hopeful that this summer I can get them a little bit closer and be in my yard. And as much as I talked about photos being kind of hard sometimes, you can tell this is a terrible photo. My phone focused really well on that bone set and the whole bee is blurry. But it still shows enough of the characteristics that we need to identify it. We can still see the rusty patch. We can still see that little thumbtack shape on the thorax, how the black comes to a point there. And so don't feel like all your pictures have to be works of art. I would say there's nothing on this slide that I would want to print out and hang on my wall. None of them are beautiful pictures like that, but they all have really important data behind them. So this next one is a mulberry. happens to be a white mulberry, but there are two mulberries in Minnesota, a red and a white. The red is almost functionally extirpated. Very, very few of them in the state. Most are white mulberry, and a lot of them are escaped from horticultural settings or planted settings. And so there's a researcher at the University of Minnesota who just wants to have people adding pictures of mulberries, really hoping to find more of the red mulberry. The upper right is noble corydalis. So I do a lot of my volunteering work at the Como Woodland Outdoor Classroom. I'm sort of across from Como Zoo. And every spring, enormous areas are taken over by this invasive plant, or non-native. I guess we haven't determined that it has moved to not invasive status. Yeah. But we as volunteers who are out there every spring, we know that it's been there for many years. I put a picture on Inaturalist, and this species has never been recorded in Minnesota before. Okay, so if we found it at Como Park, it's probably not a brand new to Minnesota thing, right? But I reported it to the Department of Agriculture, to the Arrest the Pest. And then they were able to go out, take herbarium vouchers and verify, yes, this is the first recorded sighting in Minnesota, and then go to Inaturalist and realize there are other places in the metro area that it's been spotted. So who knows when this would have gotten on the radar of MDA, right? If there weren't ordinary people out there who were taking pictures and using Inaturalist. Lower right here is an ash tree, but the important thing I want you to notice are these circles that have been cut out of it. So leaf cutter bees cut those pieces and carried them back to their nests. So there's a project on Inaturalist, Megachile leaf cuts. I'm looking at what those plants are because everyone looks for bees on flowers. And we know if you want bees, you should plant flowers, but we've totally ignored their nesting habits. So we don't know. All we can tell from this one picture is that there's a bee who has used an ash tree for their nest. But if we get enough pictures up here, then we might be better able to determine, whoa, you know what? Ash trees are not terribly important to bees for their pollen, but we really need to have them around if we want any of these bees to nest and successfully reproduce. Next up, this yellow throat. And I throw it up there. Partially, I will say, all of my good mammal and bird pictures on Inaturalist, they're all dead. It's the only way that I get them still in focus. But I've added several different pictures of birds from window strikes where I had noticed them on the sidewalk next to a big glass window. And then there's a project on Naturalist where they grab my pictures. So I'll get a little notification that the curator of so-and-so has tagged your picture. And so now I know that I can include more information when I put this up instead of just, seems to have been a window strike or dead on pavement, right? I can include, was it, how tall is the building, which direction is it facing? And so this could help them determine some better qualities for building buildings that have a lot less bird strike. The last one was very exciting when I saw a coyote as I got off the bus on St. Paul campus to go to work one day. A couple of years ago at this point, it feels like coyotes are everywhere in the city, but there's an Inaturalist project, the Urban Fox and Coyote Project, that's tracking where they are. And so again, even if you just happen to document what you see because it's interesting, you're not necessarily going out there and spending a lot of time where my goal the next 3 hours is to just take pictures. You can really be adding a lot of really valuable data. So I extolled a lot of the virtues of Inaturalist there, but if you want to get into some more of the nuts and bolts, we have webinars from last year that are on the Great River Greening's YouTube channel. So other similar projects, if you are into this sort of photo-based reporting, one is the Minnesota Bumblebee Atlas, and they're coupled with this yellow icon here for Bumblebee Watch. So they use another app and website called Bumblebee Watch by the Xerces Society, which is very similar to Inaturalist in that you just need to upload your pictures. You don't necessarily have to know what they are. The two big differences are that it's specific to bumblebees And then the other is that they don't crowdsource their identification. They have a handful of people who are experts in their system who will go through and verify your photos. So while it's another level really of quality control, you know, if the expert on Bumblebee Watch has told you that you have a rusty patch bumblebee, you have a rusty patch bumblebee. You know, that's a very trustworthy ID. The problem is that these are not people who are paid by Bumblebee Watch. They usually have their own busy field seasons. And so if you're putting a picture up in July, it might not get identified right away, right? The people just have other things that they have to be doing. And so that lag can sometimes be frustrating for volunteers, but you just have to kind of understand what's happening behind the scenes. So the Minnesota Bumblebee Atlas uses that Bumblebee Watch platform, but they have a system of grids. And so you essentially adopt a grid and follow their protocols to report what you see there. I did already kind of give you the lowdown on this Mega Kylie leaf cut project, but another thing on iNaturalist that you could look for. And then eButterfly is another one of these sort of repositories for pictures of just butterflies. So another way that you could help out do some monitoring without killing any bees, any insects, butterflies, what have you, are just to take observations. So a couple different ways this could work. It could be by netting. And even then, there's a whole range of things that you could be doing. So I think this time I can actually say in a previous life, because now it's been almost 10 years, but I was an elementary science teacher. And if you give an insect net to a kid, well, the first thing they do is they put it on the head of the kid next to them. But once they're focused and looking for insects, they find something big and cool, and then they run after it and they scoop it. So this gets you some data, but kind of like iNaturalist, it finds you those big ones. It finds you, the really obvious ones who are on the tops of flowers. And so that's not a very fair way of comparing two habitat sites. So sometimes researchers will just give themselves some more rules, whether that's I'm walking on along transect, maybe it's just swooshing, back and forth. And then at the end of whatever time period, you take your net and you find what's in it. It could be, I'm going to spend, 10 minutes and go this distance, and I have that amount of time to collect. So there are ways of standardizing it, but it still is hard to make that exactly the same and repeat it over and over. So experienced researchers can do their ID in the field. Not everybody can. If you're really experienced, your eyes are attuned to different things. And so you often catch more and you'll catch a greater diversity of things. There are the opportunity to see what flower those are on. Again, if you put out those cup traps, you have no idea which flowers those insects use. But if you are taking your net or walking down your transect, you can see exactly, and you can record it at that minute. There's a really high human input, right? It takes a lot of time for individuals to look at a space. And so depending on kind of what manpower you have available, that changes it. So the picture on the right is another bee atlas picture where we had volunteers along roadsides catching bumblebees for 10 minutes, identifying them and releasing them. And so, right, that standardizing that effort, knowing exactly how long they're out collecting for, and changing that if there are more people, right? One person for 10 minutes is different from two people for 10 minutes. So you can standardize that by having the two people collect together for 5 minutes each. But because we sent people out to roadsides and we asked them what flowers those bumblebees were using, we came back with a really great list of horrible invasive species that bumblebees were relying on. And so if you looked at the top 5 most common plants, one conclusion you might be tempted to draw is that, oh, bird's-foot trefoil, knapwood, these are fabulous bee plants. We should plant them everywhere. Please don't plant them everywhere. But because that's what was available, right? We found them on roadsides. Roadsides tend to have low low diversity of native plants, a lot of times on purpose. You know, they've been planted to have these other species, these non-native ones that were supposed to have erosion control or supposed to not need mowing or whatever other desirable qualities. But again, it's sort of just not taking that information at face value, right? Why are they there? So a couple of opportunities if you're into this sort of thing. One is that you can up the sort of the value of your data from this capture and release if you do mark and recapture. And so unfortunately, I only have a picture of a honeybee, not of a native bee, but put a little dot on them so you can space out. Go out one day, catch a bunch of them, put a mark on them, let them all go, come back the next day or 2 days later and catch a whole bunch more. And so you can kind of tell then, like, oof, you know what? We got, you know, about half of them when we came back the second day were marked. And so you can make some predictions about what the greater population looks like. Or if you come back and the second time and none of them were caught the first time, like, wow, that means there really must be a lot of them out there. So it helps you get a better take on what's happening with that population size. The other place I would send you to is Monarch Joint Venture. So used to be known as Monarch Larva Monitoring Project. And so this is looking at one particular site over a season and going and counting number of monarch eggs, number of monarch caterpillars, what instar they're in, so kind of what stage they will grow a bit and then shed their exoskeleton and then grow some more. Each of those stages are called instars. And so that kind of data tracking over the summer becomes really important. Way more important than if you just went out and said, I saw 15 monarch butterflies. Okay, great. We have no idea if you saw all the ones that were to be seen. We have no idea, you know, what that means. And so looking at how many of them seem to be surviving to the next level. And again, that full season is really important. So these are in here, not as things that I expected to do, but just sort of, holy cow, the world of pollinator monitoring is really interesting and people are being really creative. So one, they're using specially trained dogs to sniff out bumblebee nests. I actually followed one on Facebook. His name was Darwin the bee dog. He's since died, unfortunately, and they're training a new one, Jane. And so it's really fascinating to look at what is that process like. And again, can they find bumblebee nests that we can't? Bumblebee nests are often pretty hard to see. And so it's really hard to know what's going on. The other image here is there are a number of people I've seen who are starting to use camera trapping. So it's more common for bigger animals, right? You put up a game camera. People do it if they're hunters. You know, there are a lot of nature centers and such in the Twin Cities now. Cedar Creek has their Eyes in the Wild project. And so they'll accumulate all these pictures and then after this like Zooniverse. So volunteers will look through and can identify what those animals are. But people are doing it for bees and insects. So that's pretty cool, right? That gets you at a whole nother level of data that you wouldn't get if you were trying to mobilize people and pay enough grad students and send people out there to do all that collecting. So this is your time. If you have insect questions for me, we'll talk a little bit about the Great River greening opportunities, kind of to round us out. But I've seen the chat looks pretty quiet. I do appreciate that Amy has gone in and added a couple of those links. But if any of that was confusing, totally blew your mind, if you are really curious about a certain volunteer opportunity or program, I'd be happy to take that now. Aha, this is a great question. So Becca in the chat has asked about permitting. So if you need a permit or not, depends on a lot of things. As a general rule of thumb, if anything you're going to do is harmful to insects, you should contact the land manager and ask. So, or I think it's good practice. I will say when I took insect taxonomy and as students, we had to make insect collections. We were told nothing. We would just go out, collect insects. If everybody went to the same garden on campus, no one was concerned. I don't think that's a great practice. I think that if you're going to capture them, if you're going to pin them, keep them as specimens, no matter who you are, you should double check that that is okay. And typically it's not going to be okay on places like state land, SNAs, state parks, those things. If you are part of a research project, you can usually apply for a permit and often be granted. The other thing that's really important to think about is the rusty patch bumblebee. And so the US Fish and Wildlife Service has a map of all the areas where rusty patch bumblebees have been seen recently and sort of where they anticipate that they could be based on some modeling from where was the nearest place they've been seen, how long ago was that, what is the habitat like, what are the land management decisions there. And so anything that's considered in the high potential, both low and high potential zones there, which includes the entire metro area. If you are going to do any handling of bumblebees, you do need to be under a permit from Fish and Wildlife Service. So, and that is not real easy to get. I mean, you need to be pretty well qualified, experienced. And so, but going out anywhere and taking pictures is totally fair game. The only exception is you stick to your own property or public property. I mean, I'm not worried about walking around and finding bees on boulevards, but I've heard a couple of people who reported rusty patch bumblebees like on other people's farms, and those owners weren't always terribly amenable, and not because they hate rusty patch bumblebees, but because they worry about some of the implications, right? Does this mean that Fish and Wildlife Service is going to come after me and I'll never be able to use another herbicide on my property again? It doesn't mean that, but the endangered species rules for insects are just like, we don't maybe have them figured out quite as well as, like, obviously if you find someone who has a tiger skin in the back of their car, you better have some documentation as to where that came from. But if you got a rusty patch bumblebee in the grill of your car while you were driving, right? No one's going to issue you a fine for that. And so it's just a little different from some of our more charismatic megafauna. Does that get at what you wanted, Becca? I feel like I maybe went on a little bit of tangent there. All right, good. Anything else? See Amy and Becca tooting back in. I'll pull their slide up to talk a bit about Great River greening, but you're still welcome to throw any questions for me in the chat.
Great, thank you, Britt. Yeah, if you have any other questions during the duration of the time about insects for Britt or about Great River greening, feel free to add them to the chat or unmute and we can discuss. But I just wanted to kind of recap some of the things Britt touched on how Great River greening is involving volunteers in this. So we do hope to have some hands-on field day training in later spring. Details are still getting finalized, but that'll be a field day out at a site with other Bee Lab educators, UMN extension educators, experts to help us with that identification and trapping or taking photos of what we're seeing. So we also have a list down there, the tiny URL, GRGBs. I'll throw that in the chat as well. So if you are really excited about getting kind of first notice when these events go live, I will send that out to everyone on this list. So folks who have attended this webinar or some of the others in our series will get first notice. So those dates will be coming soon. We'll also, earlier in the chat, I added the link to Great River Greening's iNaturalist project sign up page. So we are utilizing iNaturalist in kind of all the ways Britt was highlighting to get folks out on some of the places where we've been doing habitat restoration or adding to enhancement or restoring pollinator habitat, to just see what's out there, and using, volunteers and community science members to kind of be our eyes on the field. Since we're a small staff at Great River Greening, unfortunately, we don't get to spend as much time out in the field as we'd like, making those observations ourselves. So we love to see observations popping up of what you're seeing out there. And hopefully it's a great way for you to check out some new parks or places in your area that maybe you didn't know existed. And then, of course, like we mentioned earlier, Great River Greening is a habitat restoration organization, and we involve volunteers in most of the steps along the way. And so we do have a full lineup of just spring events set right now that are open for registration if you're interested in helping to plant some native forbs, trees, do some seeding, or invasive or nuisance plant removal. We've got opportunities for you to get involved doing that. So I think that's kind of all I wanted to share right now. Becca, do you want to add any kind of final remarks?
I do. So Britt covered a number of ways that we're going to be monitoring these restoration sites. So I mentioned that we're going to have a number of parks and public areas that are going to be worked on this spring that we're interested to see. Okay, so we've planted some plants. Have we gotten any more insects on these areas? She mentioned the literally just go out and walk and count things. That is one of the ways that we're going to be monitoring these sites. The other way we're going to be doing this monitoring this spring is indeed iNaturalist. So we'll have a suite of projects open, specifically geared towards involving the community and anyone who's interested in taking specific pictures of pollinators that they might see at these areas, having the U of M Bee Lab identify them and again, give us some more information on these specific work projects that we've started this spring. And finally, we will indeed actually be having some facilitated through the Bee Lab and Xerxes Society, who hold the appropriate sampling permits. We'll be engaging in actually capturing bumblebees, having them, the Xerxes Society and the Bee Lab ID them, and then mark and release them. So that is another opportunity that'll happen possibly again, starting this late spring. Details are being finalized now as we figure out some of the site details, but we will both post them on our greatrivergreening.org events, as well as if anyone is interested, feel free to just email either Amy or I, and we'll be able to give you more information on those different types of ways to be involved in the project specific to us. But again, go outside, look at things, take pictures of things, and just see what else you can see. Share that information if you can. And I think should be excited as the snow seemingly starts to melt, that it will be spring soon and there'll be things out and moving again.
All right. You do have one slide. Is this important to you guys?
Yeah, we might as well. So we've got in part of this, if you have time that you need to volunteer for anything. So if you've got an organization that is looking for volunteer hours, or if you're a master naturalist, master gardener, that sort of thing, we would like people to log their time and actually record efforts. Literally could just be out for a walk and taking pictures of the organisms that they're seeing. Again, doesn't actually have to be insects on this one. Can be largely any observations that you're making on these specific sites. Definitely interested in giving people credit for their time. As we've mentioned, we value how much time all of this actually takes, especially if it's out walking and uploading pictures and that sort of thing. So we've got a couple, again, contact for Amy, specifically with the volunteer side of things, and we've got another tiny URL to link for our time log on this one. I think largely that wraps it up. Amy, do we have anything else?
No, just thanks to everybody for joining us. Like I said, there's a bunch of links in the chat, as well as my email address and Becca's email address. If you have any other questions that pop up, we can also put you in touch with Britt. There's, yeah, a lot of great resources out there, and hopefully tomorrow we'll be able to get it up on our YouTube channel. So if you need to reference any of this, we'll get that out. Oh, yep. Yep, Ellen, yep, perfect. And great, yeah, Britt threw her email address in the chat as well. So yeah, thanks again, and thanks Britt for the great presentation and information. And if you haven't watched the other 2 videos in the Pollinator series that we recorded late last year with Britt, those are also really great tips on Inaturalist basics, how to photograph bees and different pollinators, as well as telling the difference between kind of bees and their imitators are kind of the topics of the big ones. So check those out. Otherwise, thanks again. The recordings are on our YouTube. I'll send links out as well tomorrow. I'll send kind of a recap email to everyone who was on this live recording with the link to today's video, as well as those pre-recorded YouTube videos as well. All right.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all. Have a great rest of your day. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. It was very interesting.